We have about a half an hour left in this part of our seminar for questions and, I presume, answers. Did I mention this already? If the questioners would please go over to the microphone to lodge your question, tell us who it is that you want to direct your question to, and that person will respond. And I'll serve as moderator for this part of it because I know you.
My question probably is for all three of you. Do you think our system of democracy is inherently uncivil? I mean, we say anything we please in this society, and a lot of times I'm talking about us, say things for effect. And we don't really mean what we say. You brought up federalism, Hamilton. He said what he thought, and devil make the difference. Devil take the hind part. I'm saying, do we think that our democracy is inherently uncivil? Each of them.
Well,
you want to start?
I'll start. The simple answer is yes. Of course. I mean, partisan debate is rarely going to be very nice. And certainly not in a democracy. And obviously that's what Hamilton and Jay were talking about. I do think that there probably has to be in a democracy certain aristocratic elements that combat that and that are in tension with it. And when you lack that, or you get a bogus aristocracy, the aristocracy of compassion and general niceness, you're in trouble. And I don't see anything left in our democracy of that old aristocratic tradition, so I'm hoping it can come from below. I'm hoping it comes from below, from the bottom, from tough guys.
Professor Corwin.
Well, I guess I'm, historically speaking, you might say, a little more optimistic than Professor Bauman. In my earlier writings on civility, I argued that there was a kind of civility that was distinctive to the early modern period. On this, I think Professor Bauman agrees with me. I was less inclined to interpret it as aristocratic. However, I felt that there's a basis in modern thought for a new, more egalitarian notion of civility appropriate to the modern world. I still think that, but that kind of civility, too, is very much under stress. First of all, it is a fact that democratic politics naturally tend toward partisanship and vulgarity, and therefore toward incivility, and it's not as if American politics have ever been distinguished by a high level of civility. They haven't.
It's vast.
Yeah, but I do think that things are worse now for a variety of reasons, and one of them that Professor Bauman mentioned is romanticism, right? That early modern civility required self-restraint. That self-restraint was conceived in a not an aristocratic way, a new, more egalitarian way. Still, it did require self-restraint and understood self-restraint to be a virtue, and probably the most pernicious aspect of romanticism is precisely that romanticism denies that such self-restraint is a virtue. Instead, as Professor Bauman suggested, it regards true human excellence as being perfect candor, frankness, self-expression, and unfortunately we've moved very far down that road, right, in our society. So I agree that it's a constant struggle for civility and democracy, but I think that it's become even a greater struggle in our age than it had to have been.
Professor,
Kortansky.
forgive me,
That's quite all right.
but
Well, I'll just
the
say
same
briefly,
question.
you're just asking
You-
us for our take on this. I am the least optimistic among the three of us. I share all of Bauman's pessimism and am not confident that we can find renewed resources at the bottom or from the bottom. I think things are worse. There is something unraveling, and that the concern about civility is not altogether hypocritical, but is based on, or at least it involves, a certain sensitivity to what it is that's unraveling. I have my reasons for thinking that, but I would rather save those for when or if I get a chance to ask a question more directly of Professor Bauman.
Okay.
Wade Hamilton, Hiram class 1999. I just have a brief question. Anyone can answer it. I know there's a lot of talk of civility and it being lost, but I would say since 2008 you've had a dynamic that's coming to America that never existed before. And I'm just a realist. How can you really have civility in American politics when you have a leader whose citizenship is constantly questioned and his leadership is not respected from Republican and Democrats? How can you actually have civility in American politics when you have a president right now whose citizenship is still questioned? I don't think you can, because there's actually, when you have that dynamic, you basically have a rejection of your leader, of your elected leader.
Well, I would just say this, Mr. Hamilton, that what you've adduced is evidence of spectacular incivility in American politics, of which much more evidence could be adduced. I agree with you that that's a particularly striking and pernicious example. But I don't think that that in itself demonstrates the impossibility of civility, right? There's always been incivility in American politics. There's always been incivility in any politics. It's not as if civility and incivility can't exist side by side. It's not as if civility can't wage a struggle with incivility.
I agree, but when has there ever been a president whose citizenship has been questioned? I mean, I'm only 33 years old, so I'm still relatively young, but since I've been alive, I've never seen a leader whose citizenship and credentials are constantly questioned.
Could take a shot at that. I mean, that's certainly been raised about him. I don't know anybody else that's been raised about it. But what that charge means, and it is a very nasty and uncivil charge, is you are an alien, you are not one of us, you are not an American.
That's what I'm getting at.
Well, the charges made against other presidents, including George Bush, Bush Hitler is one I remember, the charge of dual loyalty against some of his advisors because they were Jews and Zionists, yeah, was also the charge, you are not one of us, you are an alien, you are our enemy. The charges against Lincoln, he was an ape, he was a gorilla, he was a subhuman, not one of us. And that was Lincoln. I think, bad as that one is, it's not as bad as some of the stuff that's been out there even in recent years. And it's also, I think, a good sign. I would be optimistic where you're so pessimistic that, you know, with all the history we have about race, country was overwhelmingly happy when he was elected. And the people who are yelling about citizenship are, I think, pretty fringy. And pretty much an embarrassment to the rest of us.
I would agree with that, but as you're constantly seeing, I'm seeing here states such as Arizona, Idaho, I believe Wyoming is another one where they're going to draw up measures where his citizenship will be questioned because of the validity of his birth certificate. I don't recall that ever happening to George Bush or Bill Clinton.
That's news to me. I don't think that's going to happen.
So that's.
I mean, I don't see any likelihood of any state, no matter how retrograde, you know, denying his citizenship. I mean, I think that's not in the ballpark.
Okay.
Alex.
Alex Meter, a sophomore Garfield Scholar. My question is for Professor Bauman. My question, you mentioned a desire to see politicians be honest with what they're doing in their public statements. Now, I agree with you. Such honesty will be fantastic in our public discourse, but I also don't see how it's viable in any fashion.
Here's what I mean. If there's something that everybody knows but you're not supposed to say, take the risk and say it. There aren't more cops. The entitlements are out of hand. Yeah? We have such, you know, a set of up in the attic plaster saints up there that you can't say, third rail, woo, wee, yeah. There are ways of doing it that are blunt and also not stupid. It takes great skill in that kind of crudeness to do it. And you got to pick your moments, and you got to pick a time when public opinion is almost ready for it, and it's very risky. But it can be done, and it often can be done in the form of, gee, you know, you were right about something. When it's obvious to everybody that Obama's policy on Guantanamo is about the same as Bush's, it wouldn't kill him to admit it openly. He would get vast credit from people who feel unjustly maligned because he won't admit it. And that raises the possibility, at least, of a kind of reciprocity. Talking about how people should be reciprocal will get you nothing, but imposing a debt on them, a moral debt on them, might just work.
I see your point. Thank you.
Hello, thank you all. My name is Rodney Jacobs. I'm a junior Garfield Scholar as well. And my question can go to any of you guys that would like to answer. And I know that civility does have its place within American politics. However, I do agree with some of you in saying that it has been either gone or not so much brought up since the early modern eras. That being the case, do you feel as though that funneling many issues into just one spectrum of civility is really taking away from the actual principle or the issues of our politics? I feel as though that potentially the real issue in politics is really not civility, but the real issue is gender, religion, and race that may be attributed to certain differences that our politicians may be facing. I would even assert that these are the reasons why people are really distraught today in our society, and that trying not to redefine these instances and where we have disagreement is not really incivil, but maybe just passion on politics. And I feel as though now more than ever, politicians are saying, hey, since I'm not going to get my way in these instances, I'm just not going to share my toys with the kids at daycare. There really is a difference between just being incivility and just not really seeing the different ideological stances in our society.
I'll take a shot, if you like. You want to start? Okay. Big question, you know, are we citizens? Are we all part of one thing? Or are we basically loyal to our ethnic groups and our religion and our race? That's a huge question. It's a huge question, always been for a country like the United States, which has claimed to make, you know, a pluribus unum, out of many one. Indeed. Big question. I would have thought that the election of our first black president would have been good news on those scores, and that the attempt to keep talking about gender and race and religion actually makes it impossible to deal with issues that are not issues of identity. Now, if your view is it's all identity, well then, in the end, you know, the best we're going to be is Belgium. Yeah, with the Flemish and the Walloons fighting about what language ought to be spoken. If there's something more there than that, then I think it's probably not smart to keep pounding on identity issues. Because identity issues, as I suggested, are existential. They're total. I am a and you can't. Much better if we can say, yeah, I'm a this and you're a that, let's cut a deal.
Indeed.
And that's what I mean by focusing on the real issues. But you may be right that the real issues are who we are and who we define ourselves as being, but that's ultimately going to lead to civil war.
When I gave an earlier version of this talk at Michigan State University a few weeks ago, and at a very late stage in the discussion, someone pointed out that it had not yet been mentioned that Obama was a black president, and that he thought that that was a remarkable fact and a sign of progress, that Obama could be discussed so thoroughly by an audience of both whites and blacks without that issue even being raised. I think that Obama himself understands this stance rooted in empathy as moving beyond identity politics, right? That is to say, Obama thinks that America has made great progress in these matters. The problems still remain and so on. He always acknowledges that. But I think that Obama himself thinks that identity politics have become much more the problem, right, than the solution in America today. And one of the ways in which Obama has shown a certain amount of political courage, in fact, right, is by speaking out in certain issues in ways that the older black, political leadership in the country would not have spoken. But there's no doubt, in my mind at least, that Obama hopes that a general kind of outlook of, that a politics centered on what he means by empathy, which again is something complicated, would be a way of appreciating the differences that divide America in a way that would, be a bigger step toward moving beyond those differences as the defining issues of American politics.
Thank you.
I'm an alumna from 78 NOLA Horvath, and I want to invite some consideration of how the media, and specifically, I think it started with the right wing. They seem to get out there first with the, not Glenn Beck, who's the other guy? Rush Limbaugh, right. And how the negativity in their debates has emphasized this incivility and infiltrated into the political discussion, but not just inviting comment on their results, but how their motives are individual financial gain in the capitalistic system, rather than to constructively add ideas that would advance political agenda or just getting the job done. That's not really what they have in mind. It's easier to break something apart than it is to build it. So I'd like to invite comment on how the financial incentive of the media is eating away at our political power on both sides to get that job done.
Well, you want to go, John?
Well, I would simply say this, that financial incentives to the media are an essential aspect of a free press, right? Wherever you have a free press, the whole point is that there's competition, and that competition is going to be guided largely by financial gain. So that's not new, right?
That's not new. We've had that in newspapers throughout the ages. They wanted to sell papers. I get that.
Yeah, that's right. And what you have now is, the 500-channel universe with, all of these different constituencies, and therefore one can preach to a very, precise segment of the converted. I agree with you that this has done absolutely nothing to raise the tone of American politics. On the other hand, the general problem has always been with us. And I don't think you can argue that the press as a whole, right, is more vociferous or partisan today than it's been in the past. And again, what's the alternative? The alternative would be the absence of a free press, and I would, much, prefer the free press with all its warts, to its absence.
You want to be empathetic. You have to look at these guys the the way they look at themselves, just to see. And it's easy to say, you know, oh, they don't really believe this stuff, they're doing it for money. Except that's exactly what they're saying back the other way. The anger that's built up on both sides is real. And everybody feels they're getting back. I'm getting back at you. Now, there, now you know how I felt.
And that's the incivility that we're talking about.
In this country, increasingly, it's a ratchet effect. And you look in congressional politics, the Thomas hearings, the treatment of Speaker Wright, back and forth. I got a special prosecutor because you got a special prosecutor. It's a very ugly politics. And I would say it started, from my point of view, in Vietnam, on both sides. That's when the press in particular, out of a feeling of righteousness, the dishonest, lying, Tonkin Gulf resolution, all that, went past limits it used to have. There's a Frances Perkins, who was Secretary of Labor under Roosevelt and Truman. We both knew her. This is a story she told. It was a rule that you could never photograph Roosevelt being carried out of a train and put into and a photographer once did take a picture of him being carried. And Frances Perkins, a little lady, got up and said to him, "Young man, give me that camera. You know perfectly well you're not supposed to do that." She rips the film out, throws it underfoot, stomps on it. That was 1936 or whatever that was. That world's gone, and it was Vietnam that killed it, for good or for ill. And now the question is, how do we get back? And blaming the other guy for having bad motives is part of the problem, not part of the solution, I'm afraid.
My question concerns empathy, although it could also apply to sympathy, compassion, charity. I remember reading a book in political science class here at Hiram when I was a student in the 70s about basic personality traits. That book just dealt with two personality traits: the kind of personality that becomes more entrenched in times of crisis and more stuck, I guess, in their tracks, versus the kind of personality that becomes more flexible in times of crisis, more open to suggestion, more open-minded. And it cited various ex-presidents and so on. In any case, my question is, with respect to empathy, is it a tool that politicians use in their favor, much like a big phony smile or a great big checking account that really doesn't have any of their money in it? Or is empathy a genuine personality trait?
You should answer that. Yeah.
Well, I would say that empathy is a genuine personality trait, which, like most genuine personality traits, can be fake. Right? There's no form of virtue that doesn't generate a corresponding form of hypocrisy, right? So that would be true of empathy as well as being true of any other political virtue. I mean, it is, of course, a fact about the empathy of politicians that, insofar as it consists of spending money, it is, of course, other people's money that they're spending, right? So in that respect, I think one is entitled to be somewhat suspicious of it. I mean, that too was, I think, a defect of compassion, actually, so-called, which caused Mr. Obama to move away from that word. But I don't think that one can answer your question generally. I mean, some politicians are genuinely empathetic. Some politicians are more empathetic than others. That empathy almost always becomes in some way instrumental to their political ambitions. Well, right, that's just a fact of politics, right? That any virtue or its appearance becomes instrumental to one's political ambitions.
Can I add something? Because the first question was about what good are these sessions? And I think something's relevant here. I believe empathy is a disposition. Some people are more that way than others. And it also can be faked. Louis B. Mayer's famous line, "Sincerity is everything. Once you can fake that, you've got it made." But empathy, as Professor Irwin emphasized, is also very much an intellectual trait. And an education which teaches you to see the other guy's point of view, and not just your own, and really to take it seriously, if you have to write papers where you don't just get graded on making your case, but also the other guy's case as well as you can, I think that aids empathy. I just got an email from a former student of mine who was he's a lieutenant in the Marines, returned from Afghanistan. And he said, reading the great books really helped me because I had to work with the Afghan National Army, seeing the other guy's point of view, empathy. That was something I never knew I had in me, and it sure helped having read those great books. So that's an advertisement for things like this. You can actually train empathy to a considerable degree if you're willing to do it.
Thank you.
Here's my question. It has to do with whether civility is thriving or dying. One of the changes that I've noticed in my lifetime was you used to get the same basis of information. You would watch Walter Cronkite, you'd use the World Book, you'd read the same magazines, you'd have different opinions, but there was a basic agreement on facts. I think that has bifurcated dramatically, where people don't read newspapers, they go to the website that's going to support their point of view, and you get your red meat handed to you, if it's Rachel Maddow or it's Glenn Beck, so that simple things like, climate change, rather than being a scientific debate, becomes a pro-con talking point on television. And where it's a significant view that people don't think the president's an American citizen. It's a widely held belief. It's not just a fringe element anymore. Even Wikipedia, there is now a conservative Christian Wikipedia, as if those facts. How do you think that's impacted civility, is my question. I think it's made it worse. What do you think?
I agree with you. I agree with you entirely. And this is an earlier question asked about money. And this, I think, is where money really does come in. That capitalism and the market cater to markets and niche markets. And when political discourse becomes a matter of niche markets, which it has, exactly what you described tends to happen. And that is a very serious problem. I agree with you completely.
Yeah. And that, of course, is a new development in a way, right? I mean, previously the media appealed to the broadest possible markets.
There was a mainstream acceptance of facts, certain facts. You may agree with Vietnam or not, but you knew about what was going on there. And maybe it was accurate, maybe it was inaccurate, but everybody was getting similar information. Not true anymore, I don't think.
And in any case, it was much more difficult to shelter yourself, right, from the opinions and outlooks different from yours. So yeah, I agree with you that obviously the fragmentation of the politically concerned citizens into groups, each of which has a media outlet that caters to its prejudices and encourages it to not to look beyond those prejudices, but to remain ever more completely within them. That is certainly a very bad thing for certainly what Mr. Obama means by empathy, but also by civility, and especially in the issue of civility, because it so much fosters a conspiratorial view of the world and of politics, right? I mean, that's
validated over and over again.
And of course, nothing kills any possibility of empathy so much as that conspiratorial view of one's opponents.
Could I just add, I detect in the sort of question that you raised a certain wishful thinking. Can't we get back to the day when we all just got along and didn't have these divisions among ourselves that are exacerbated by the news media for reasons that Professor Bauman and Orwin both mentioned? Well, that is a kind of a sweet wish, but it's not going to happen. The concern for civility, I think, involves a recognition that those days are bygone and a hope that we might find a new sort of social protocol whereby disagreements would be more legitimate, in the moral sense of the word legitimate, and yet nevertheless we would not have to go to each other's throats. President Obama's concern with empathy, as Orwin outlined it, is an expression of that hope. Whether it'll work is a long question.
Thank you.
I would like to move from the context of national talk radio, the president, and the senators and few congressional leaders that are quoted most often in the national media. And then I'll come back to them. My pitch, to which I'd like you to react, is that the majority of the American people have it right to criticize the loss of civility in the special, narrow arena I just outlined. And a large part of that is based on operational values. So let me define civility not as content, but as process. So that you have a United States trade representative meeting with a Chinese trade representative. And an aspect of civility would be to leave a graceful way for your opponent to retreat on a point that he or she is going to have to retreat on. Because you are going to meet that opponent again and again and again. And there's times when you're going to have to retreat on a point. But each of your governments has required you to get together and work. I submit to you that exactly the same skills of civility apply between a union bargainer and a company bargainer in dealing in a collective bargaining situation where that's deemed legitimate. Those are operational values. And I think Americans know, whether it's an informal club or whether it's a union or whether it's the Labor Department in a company, that picking the person who speaks most like Rachel Maddow or Rush Limbaugh is not your best negotiator. There's an operational value because you have to continue to live with one another. Okay. Now, if we see the values of civility in the negotiating context, let's now return to that narrow arena. And what I see the American people saying is, there is work to be done here, apart from the content on any individual policy. And we see, we the American people, not each and every one of them, not the extremes, not the boisterous and the loud, we see a trend developing where people do things that we know are contrary to these operational values and mean that if there is undiscovered common ground, it will remain undiscovered because you've engaged in so many ad hominem arguments, you can no longer work together. And there's lots of things that drive that, and a number of the questions have asked it. You have presented many of them. But I find it helpful to pull back, and then I'll leave, that's my main question. If you happen to know anything about Minnesota Nice, I'd like you to tell me about that too, because I find that a fascinating phenomenon within the United States, that you've got an electorate that apparently punishes people for not being civil, although Minnesota certainly has had its extremes, but there is a thing called Minnesota Nice that national commentators who have studied it and people in Minnesota know. So, but take the first issue, if you will, of civility as a process that permits people to get to results.
Well, can I take that? I'm with you a lot. Two things come to mind. One is game theory, where there's a game theory thing called prisoner's dilemma, where it always turns out to be the right thing to do to rat and to implicate the other guy. But it turns out if you play that game again and again and again, if it's reciprocal, which is your point, and it's repeated, then people have to behave better. And I agree with that. One of the things I pointed to that I don't like about American politics is how symbolic, how much it's become a matter of moral fashion, of witnessing and presenting. The union bargainer and the company bargainer, you're absolutely right about that. They've got to make a deal. One of the best things about being in a liberal arts college, believe it or not, is, and being in a political minority, is being on faculty committees. Because then we don't stereotype each other. We've got to come to an arrangement. Absolutely. And that's why Tocqueville talks about the importance of associations. Gets people out of the house, gets them from demonizing each other. They've got to work with each other. They have to learn what he calls the forms of liberty. And civility is actually one of those forms of liberty. It's a quasi-aristocratic thing. And you're right. I mean, it's possible for Democrats. The more privatized we get, the more symbolic our politics we get, the more it's niche markets that we pay attention to, the more danger it is. Now, your second point, and that's where I have a little bit of hope, the sense that the American people now are ready for business to get done. That means it won't be that risky for people to grasp the nettle and make concessions and say, look, let's cut the deal. A very interesting question right now is the government going to get closed down? The Republicans clearly don't want to do it, and at least the Democrats in the Senate seem to be willing to give them a graceful way not to. I really hope it works out that way. It's that kind of thing, the reciprocal concession making of people who gradually learn again to trust each other. That's what we have to hope for, and I think it's going to come if the American people are grown up and ready for it and want it. It will not happen otherwise. So I think I'm very much in harmony. Minnesota Knights, I don't know anything about it.
Trade representatives find it easier to treat one another civilly, precisely because it's only interests that they're discussing, right? And they understand this very clearly, and they have a very clear mandate. The more, in other words, they don't face one another as partisans, right? So their situation is different from that of elected politicians in a democracy. And civility is easier for them than it is for the elected politicians under current circumstances. You're certainly right, though, that there have been times when the US Congress has functioned more in that way than it does now. And to some extent, it seems to me that this is what Mr. Obama is driving at. The problem, I think, the contradiction in Mr. Obama's position is that he is himself the beneficiary, right, of the intense partisanship, which makes him so uncomfortable. And I think it is a valid criticism of him that he has not, that in a way he has perhaps been too timid in his estimation of the extent to which he could actually set himself against this partisanship by breaking from the party consensus on certain issues, trying to lead the party to a different place that would make compromise between the parties more possible. And this is a very important aspect of it, to which Professor Bauman has already alluded, thereby put pressure on the Republicans, much more effectively, to reciprocate. But if there's anything promising about the situation, I think it's that the new situation, the new balance of power, has in fact compelled him to move more in that direction. And it's interesting to me, at least, that as he has moved more in that direction, his public approval has risen, which does seem to confirm what many political scientists say, at least, which is that the American people is not nearly as politicized and therefore not nearly as uncivil as the party and media elites.
I would only add, Ken, in a way it would be nice if politics were about negotiating interests. There could be a certain honesty that would characterize that, as you suggest, but it isn't. It is also largely about badgering each other with symbols, appealing to the moral high ground, demonizing your opponent as standing outside the moral high ground, or what is practically the same thing in a democracy, standing outside the norm. And that's not going to change anytime soon, or perhaps anytime ever, at least in the foreseeable future. We have touched, but not really devoted attention on this panel to examining the reasons for that, and they are varied. It must be tempting all of your curiosity to enter into that part of the examination. Perhaps one reason is that given certain technologies, television not being the most recent, it has become easier for the American public to accept the role of being a vast audience for competitors in the game of seeking the moral high ground and claiming for themselves to represent the norm and demonizing their opponents. But whatever the reasons, we're not going to reconvert, if it was ever the case, American politics into an arrangement whereby rational people will find their way to compromise over issues. Mirabile dictu. Kathy, is she here? Yeah, I think we should probably confine this session to one more question. And Alex, if you would be so good, since you're a member of the Garfield Institute and because you've already asked a question, to yield to the person standing right behind you, this will be the last question.
You mean it would be very civil for me?
That's right. And he's done it, which shows that a higher education works.
Bob Melnick, class of '78, Professor Kortansky, my mentor.
Yeah.
This is a question that actually is directed to all of the panel. I'm kind of curious about something, and that they're basically the unknown branch, so to speak, and that's the Supreme Court. And this is a question that really does focus on civility. Many on both sides of the aisle, right and left, have tended to rely on the Supreme Court, and they've become almost a super legislature. I would submit that we're in a judicial oligarchy at this point. Maybe that's a stretch, but I use the example certainly of the Roe v. Wade situation. Many commentators said that just let the legislative process battle it out, it would have solved much of the problem. I take Gore versus Bush as a decision that kind of took it out of the electorate and forced this incivility that went on through the Bush years. I guess I would also submit that perhaps, and maybe this is an historical stretch, that Dred Scott, which Lincoln decried as an abomination and possibly helped, if not was one of the critical factors in starting the Civil War, the ultimate incivility. What is any of your members of the panel's comment on the Supreme Court's role in this? And I might also add that as this healthcare issue continues to ruminate through the lower courts and as it starts to come up to a crescendo with apparently the Supreme Court being the final arbiter, how's that going to affect civility? And one more point, and I'll listen to the remarks. I believe Canada, when they passed their Charter of Human Rights a few decades ago, has a built-in process where if there's problems politically with Supreme Court decisions in Canada, you're supposed to go back and get a supermajority to overrule them. We don't really have that in our country, but any thoughts on that?
Nice to see you again, Robert. Since you did refer to being a student here some time ago, and even a student that I remember you very fondly in my class, I will remind you of something that you've heard before in those classes. Tocqueville is famous for saying that there's something about American politics, a certain pressure, that tends to convert every question of policy into a judicial question and a legal question. That remark of Tocqueville's invites profound reflection, both as to the causes and the consequences. But one of the consequences, surely, is that questions, when converted into questions of legally vested rights, and as such the echo of natural rights, become in that way less easily compromised than questions of ordinary politics, especially if questions of ordinary politics are questions about who gets what, when, and how. The Supreme Court has been perhaps complicitous in recent times in appropriating what once were understood to be questions of ordinary politics and, well, appropriating isn't quite the right word, but translating them into a form where they hoped they could be settled by repairing to the passages of the Constitution, and especially the delineation of rights in the Constitution. But as Tocqueville indicates, it's not altogether the Supreme Court's fault. They may have been complicitous, but there's something deeper afoot.
But would you not say that they certainly are a key factor in causing?
Yeah, I agree with you.
Well, but on the other hand, though, and I mean, this is, I mean, it's ironic in a way, right? Because the Roe v. Wade, right, was a hot potato. The abortion issue was a hot potato, which presumably almost every elected politician in America breathed a sigh of relief, right, that the courts took that issue off the table. And that, of course, and abortion is not the only issue, right, in which that's been the case, in which legislators have welcomed the usurpation of their authority by courts, precisely because it means that the truly difficult decisions can be kicked upstairs to the courts, which means that you then get the pleasure and the credit for disagreeing with the decision, right, when it's adverse to you and your constituents, but being free of the responsibility for the decision. And of course, that's where a lot of politicians would like to be.
And on the third hand, and here I probably am going to sound like Glenn Beck, I'm sorry. Tocqueville also, while there are these dangers of the judicialization of political questions, is very friendly to the legal profession and very friendly to the courts, because I think he sees them as one of those forms of liberty. There's something beyond that grubby struggle of interests. At a certain point, the court speaks. And to the extent that we've all wised up and understood that, well, yeah, of course, the courts are a kind of hyper legislature, that's been taken away. Everything is turf. Everything is there to be fought for. And as a result, that leads to a kind of, going farther out and getting more leverage and being more extreme. And this is something that I think, pragmatism populism has something to do with. And also, it's a tendency in democratic society to break down limitations. You see it, limitations of decency in the movies. Lawyers who advertise, well, that was considered very shocking. As I understand it, the company that invented the pill back in the 50s had a serious argument with itself about whether it was moral to produce something that was going to make them very, very rich, and they decided it was, but at least they thought about it. Those kinds of restraints are gone, and when those restraints are gone, that's partly what I mean by the aristocratic side of things. When you get your client off, whether he's guilty or not, because you're just being a good lawyer. When you do that, and it's not just capitalism, it's in the professions, it's everywhere, it's all or nothing, then civility tends to break down because the stakes become too high. That notion of, well, we'll come back and do this again, disappears. Everything is to finally to destroy the evil enemy. So I think you're right, but I don't think the court is so much a cause as a symptom of a much larger social process.
I would even submit that the members of the court don't want to be the final arbiters. They feel compelled, and as probably the last few generations have shown, they have become the point of last resort when they really don't want to. It's almost a reluctant thing. But it's more of a generally broad question. I'm not even focusing on the Constitution per se. I'm just talking about the idea of decision-making ending up becoming almost focused upon so many of their decisions, like this Obamacare issue is going to apparently come to a crescendo, and they're going to make the decision. Will that be the final
Professor Kortansky's
decision? Probably not. But will it produce any long-lasting civility? Unlikely. So I really submit it as sort of another factor in the mix, so to speak.
Well, there you're repeating Professor Kortansky's point, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, now we're going to have a reception when we can enjoy ourselves over some liquid refreshments. And then I understand many of you are going to be staying on for dinner. And Professor Orwin will grace us with some remarks following the dinner.